This week we're doing a brief overview of the history of Moldova. I hope you took the time to read the articles that I've posted on the site because those are very important background. What we're actually going to look at here are some pictures from two museums that I went to. But some of the important things that you'll see here, actually you will have read about and understand more. For instance, if you did the reading, you will have read about, it calls him Stephen the Great and Holy. Here they call him Stefan cel Mare. You would have read about Mihail Cogălnicianu, and actually the street that I live on is called Mihail Cogălnicianu Street. So some of these people are the national heroes not only of Romania but of Moldova. You will have read about Trajan's column and the significance of that, and the Roman monument of Adam Clesi. So if you haven't done the reading, you ought to go back and do it, or you ought to do it at least right after you watch this, because I think you'll get more out of this. Here we have the entrance to the National Museum of History, as you can see there. It's actually a very impressive building. Inside, there's different color schemes for different periods of history. There's red, there's gold, there's a blue and gold room, which is my favorite, since those are my favorite colors. But it's really set up very nicely, and hopefully you'll see some of that as we go through. This is in the entrance area. It's a relief map of the entire country of Moldova. You can kind of see the hills there. The white dots represent villages and houses. You can actually see the little cluster of white there just north and east of the center, which is Chisinau, which is where we're located here in the capital. This is a really interesting map as you can walk around it and see from different angles and the rivers and where the vineyards are and just generally how the country is laid out. It sort of gives you an idea of the scope of the country and how it developed. Here's an old map of the Moldavian region. If you look closely there, you'll see some of the names that you saw in the histories that you read. Wallachia is there, Transylvania is there, Bulgaria, the Black Sea. Just gives you an idea how all of these things fit together at that point. Now we're just going to skim through history a little bit. I spent about 3 hours and took lots of pictures there, and I've just tried to pick out some of the highlights. Here what you have is a fossil. At one point in the history of Moldova, all of the land between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and if you can't picture that, grab a map and look, but all of the land between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea was actually underwater, which means essentially most or all of Moldova was underwater. And so this is one of the fossil remains. There was actually a number of them there. And sometime later in their history, they had animals like this roaming, which would be essentially a woolly mammoth type animal. That's me standing there, so you can get an idea of the scale and the size of this animal, or what's left of it. And moving ahead, what we have here is some of the earliest pottery that they found. This is really from the Dacian period, which you've read about. It's one of the earliest civilizations in this area. They were here prior to Rome. Rome essentially conquered them in order to take this area over, which from your readings you know was memorialized on Trajan's column. Now Trajan's column is white marble and is in Rome. This was a model of Trajan's column. This is just the base of it. I was trying to get some of the carvings on there, but for some reason, and the lady who was working at the museum wasn't sure, for some reason instead of making it white, they made this model out of a red material, a red stone, and this model is probably about 3 feet tall. I think it's important to note that they don't see their connection with Rome as a bad thing. This area very much has that Italian, Roman, Latin flavor, and it's no accident that they kept as the name of the overreaching country before Moldova was split out is Romania. So if you think about it that way, the fact that they use the Latin characters, the words, the roots are clearly Latin. People in this area the Romanian ethnic people in this area very much look back to the Roman Empire as their true heritage. And here's another example of that. This model of the Roman monument, which is in honor of the Roman victory over the Dacians, has a prominent place in this history museum. Moving forward a little bit, as we go through this museum, over and over again, we see Christian artifacts of various kinds from various periods. One of the things that I think was interesting in that history was how very early on, from the first century, the Romans in this area converted to Christianity, and throughout the Soviet period they held on to that. 98% of the people here claim Christianity as their religion, including, in the southern part, one of the only Turkish Christian communities in the world. Next few slides I want to go through fairly quickly. What I want you to see are the similarities between what you would expect to see in a museum in the United States covering a period of, say, the 18 and 1900s and what you're going to see here. For instance, in this slide, you see, some of which is in English, a group of teachers. We're going to see a picture of a group of teachers. We're going to see some of the manuals, and we're going to see a certificate that they got for teaching. And you'll see that in the next slide. There are the teachers down in the lower left corner. You see the little chalkboard that the students would have used. Once again, very familiar to those of us who like to go to museums in the United States. A little lesson book up there in the upper right-hand corner, and then there's a picture of the teacher there with the seal that they put on it showing that she had a right to teach. This was in the early 1900s. Here in the gold room, they had some of these rooms set up the way they would have looked then, and once again, nothing that we wouldn't expect to see here. Here we see what we would recognize as a hope chest, and they used it for the same purpose that it was used here. As you can see, the date's 1899, and what happened was that young women, before they were married, did crocheting, did knitting, whatever they did in preparation for the day when they would be married and need these things for their household, and they put them in this chest, which is called a hope chest. They did the same thing here as we did back there. And here are examples of various musical instruments that we recognize as well. A typical dining room of the period, both in Moldova and in the USA. A loom for making rugs. And a typical desk of the period as well. You can see the candlesticks there for lights and the writing instruments on it. But in spite of the fact, like most people in the world, they may have been trying to live normal lives. The reality of their geography caught up to them over and over again, as we've seen. What we have here is a room. It's a panorama, the entire 3 walls, panorama of the attack on Chisinau by the Nazis during World War II. The figures that I've heard before the war was over, anywhere from 60 to 80% of their housing and buildings were leveled. I don't want to spend too much time on the history of the 20th century now, because it's such an important time in the history of Moldova that sometime during this year we will have a unit specifically on 20th century history. But I did think this poster was interesting. As you can see, I've translated it for you at the top. Cannibal, vegetarian, or 2 sides of one coin. And you can see Adolf Hitler there patting a lamb while getting ready to shoot a person. Certainly, although World War II impacted America and how we thought about the world, for those who were here that were run over by the Nazi war machine and then the Soviet war machine, the impact was much greater, and we're definitely going to talk about that more in the future. At which time we'll also talk more about Moldova's independence, what that means to them now, what that means going forward. What you see here is a wall in the last room as you wind your way through following the history. This last room says Moldova plus liberty. That's their flag there in the middle. You see other signs, independent, political, and economic Moldova. Make Moldova independent politically and economically. So you can start to see that they're attempting, in the last 15 years, to build a culture around this new country that they find themselves in. Separated both from Romania, where so many of them came from ethnically, and separated from Russia and the Soviet Union, where many of them grew up. The last two slides I want to show you are just a couple interesting things that I saw there. As you can see, what this is the certificate someone gets when they hold a Guinness World Record. Apparently, this winemaking plant in Moldova contains over 1.5 million bottles of wine, and they're stored in 34 miles of underground galleries. That's one very large wine cellar. But anyway, I just thought you might find that interesting, that this is what, if you ever hear somebody say they have a Guinness World Record, this is what their certificate looks like. And lastly, I saw this sitting outside the History Museum and asked somebody what it was. And so this is our quiz for the week. The quiz for the week is, what do you think this is? Go out to the discussion forum and let us know. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief overview of the history of Moldova. We started way back with the fossils, moved through the early period, and then touched on some of the 20th century. As I said, some of the highlights of the 20th century especially we'll be looking at in more detail, but I thought it was important to get this broad overview. Once again, if you haven't done the readings in this week, please do them. It will make everything you just saw make so much more sense.